Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining the session today. It's great to see so many of you with us. Thanks for the introduction, Ian. I'm really pleased to be able to share some recent CPD work with you, which we've been involved in through Sport Scotland. I really hope that you find it as interesting and as insightful as I did, and I'll try to make it as interesting as possible. But hopefully it's going to provide some really useful sort of ongoing food for thought for us as we look towards the new season. So, first of all, I'm sure that many of you are possibly asking, who is Jean? Jean Cote is a professor in the School of Kinesiology and Health Studies at Queen's University in Kingston in Canada. And his research areas are of children in sport, coaching, positive youth development and sport expertise. Jean is a fellow of the Canadian Society for Psychomotor Learning and Sport Psychology, and he's regularly invited to present his work to sport governing bodies and at academic conferences throughout the world. So I'd like to give you just a little bit of a background into the relevance of Jean's work and why we've put this forward as CPD today. Basically, in response to the retirement of the UKCC qualifications, Sport Scotland's project Beyond 2020 has looked to redesign qualifications to become more representative of the needs of coaching, coaches and athletes. Sport Scotland have put a great deal of research into the literature in this field, and this points towards Jean Cote and Wade Gilbert's work to redefine what coaching effectiveness and expertise is, and how to influence content and curriculum design within the qualification framework. So essentially to look beyond the professional knowledge of coaches and begin to incorporate the sort of inter and intrapersonal knowledge which is required for effective coaching. So this work has directly fed into and informed the Sport Scotland Effective Coaching Map, which is on the screen just now, which many of you may already be familiar with. This map looks to develop coaches in 3 key areas: knowing yourself, knowing others, and knowing coaches. And Sport Scotland were invited to some learning led by Jean, Snowsport Scotland were invited to some learning led by Jean on his work in transformational coaching. And reflecting on this, we believe that this would be really useful to summarise and share with you guys as our colleagues and coaches operating within Snowsports as part of our continual professional development. So for today in the session, what I plan to do is to summarise and share some of the insight from this teaching from within the webinars. And before we delve into transformational coaching behaviours, we should consider that when we look at development for an individual through sport, we need to look at development as the product of different interacting systems. So we can't say that coaching is effective when it ignores perhaps the cultural differences, situational differences, influences of parents and peers, and all of these interacting systems, so to speak. They all have an impact on that overall outcome. So according to Jean and other researchers in this field, we should be viewing sport as a systems perspective. What would lead to positive development in sport would be the interaction of these different systems over time. And the interaction of these systems is what impacts the immediate and short-term and long-term development and participation and performance and experience for an individual. So during the first section of the session, my idea is to share with you Jean's sort of framework of sport as a developmental system and describe how all the elements affect participation, performance and personal development over time. And this should hopefully help us as coaches to frame our position within this system and to give us a landscape for which to view our practice. This system can be simplified into condensing it into 3 different elements, which is part of Jean's work, and 3 different factors that affect sport and youth sport. And these are the settings, so the actual physical setting in which sport takes place, the activities, so the physical actions that people engage with, and what you would do in a practice or in competition, and also the social dynamics, so the relationships that happen as a result of taking part in sport. We'll then move on to looking at the concepts of transformational leadership and transformational coaching to identify how we can support positive short and long-term outcomes in sport. So here I've displayed Jean's work on the personal assets framework. So essentially this model here is a summary of a lot of research that's been carried out over a number of years on athlete development and youth sport. Hopefully you've maybe had a chance to skim through the reading. I'm not sure, don't worry if you haven't. It wasn't my intention to give you all a set of homework, but it might give you just a little bit of background into the language that's used within this model. but if not, I'm going to go through it now and hopefully assert its relevance to us at the moment. So if I could just start by bringing your attention to the timeline along the bottom, so the big blue arrow which appears along the bottom of the model. And if you look at this sort of indicates that sport participation occurs over time. And if you look at the arrow along the bottom and you go to where the long-term outcomes are, so where it says multiple seasons, it would be possible to see what the desired outcomes would be, and those are categorised above that, and Jean categorises them as the 3 Ps, so participation, personal development and performance. So those are the kind of long-term outcomes over multiple seasons. If you then go slightly to the left of that on the sort of timeline arrow, you can see the single season outcomes, and these have been summarised within Jean's research as the 4 Cs, so competence, confidence, connection and character. And these are things that we would expect to develop over the course maybe of a season. And then also we've got single season or real-time outcomes, which is the immediate sport experience. Then on the far left of the model, we've got the elements. So I mentioned those briefly already as being factors that we can directly influence, and those are the setting, the activity and the social dynamics. So to pull, that was just a quick overview, but to pull this model together for us and to make sense of the research, Jean highlights that this should be, that essentially it should be interpreted that the single season and multiple season outcomes, namely the 3 Ps and the 4 Cs, are things that we cannot necessarily as coaches influence directly, but what we are able to change and influence are the dynamic elements which are seen on the left-hand side, so the activity setting, social dynamics. In altering these elements on the left-hand side, we could go some way to positively or negatively affecting the different outcomes over time, whatever that may be in a single season or in a multiple season or multiple seasons. So if we just look at this in a little bit more detail, firstly we can have a look at the outcomes, the long-term outcomes, and this is what we would ultimately want to achieve in sport. So outcome number 1 within the model relates to performance, so to develop sport skills and capabilities for future elite athletes. So within this outcome, there would be strong emphasis placed on sport-specific targeted training and the winning, essentially. An important aspect, which I'm sure a lot of us are thinking when we hear that statement, is that most of us as coaches really recognise that not all children will make it to an elite level, and we need to have a system which also supports long-term participation. So outcome 2 within the model relates to participation, and that's obviously the doing sport for fun, or perhaps as an adult recreationally to improve physical health and to encourage continued participation within that sport for life, so participation for life. And finally we've got personal development. So we ideally would want a sports system that can contribute to positive youth and positive development and developmental assets such as things like initiative, self-control, leadership, cooperation. And we know from developmental psychology research outside of sport, we know that creative activities that provide a mix of enjoyment and challenge can create an activity which is optimal for personal development. So all of these qualities, things like leadership, initiative, sense of self or cooperation, are qualities, I suppose, that we should be seeking to instill in our young people to encourage them to go on to contribute positively to society and to give back to society. And also, I suppose, as coaches, we're thinking to also potentially give back to our sport as well. So when you think about the long-term outcomes in sport, the messages that were evident in Jean's teaching were that we should really keep in mind the interplay between these 3 outcomes. So as coaches, we should perhaps consider that we don't necessarily need to pick one. It is possible to develop performance, participation and personal development within the same sports programme. An additional problem, I suppose, that Jean has highlighted and looked at within his research within coaching and the development of sports programmes is that they also seem to focus heavily on these long-term outcomes. And Jean's research suggests that it would be more effective to focus on these outcomes simply as a byproduct of the development of immediate and short-term outcomes. And this is especially important, as I'm sure most of you will probably understand, it's especially important with young people and children, and the idea that being successful in the short term will allow the long term to take care of itself, whatever that may be. So let's have a look at some of those short-term outcomes, the four, which are referred to within the personal assets framework as the 4 C's. So what Jean's research hopes to kind of encapsulate here is that if we are able to develop each of these 4 C's alongside each other, so competence, say in learning specific sports skills, or confidence in sort of developing an internal and positive sense of worth in sport, connections, so developing positive bonds with people, with coaches, with wider institutions within sport, and character, so respecting rules, understanding notions of integrity, and perhaps being empathetic towards others and competitors. If we can sort of develop each of these 4 C's alongside each other, then we would make really positive strides towards those long-term outcomes, whichever those may be, whether it's participation, performance, personal development, or a mixture of 2 or maybe 3 of those things. But if we can develop these 4 C's as we go, then that kind of allows us to make positive strides towards those long-term outcomes. And then if we look at the immediate experience, so the kind of single session immediate experience element within the personal assets framework, Jean uses the concept of interest to describe this. So it's been shown in research that interest encourages young people to come back. So I'm sure that you will all recognise from your own coaching, teaching or leading experience that when you feel like you run a session and you thought, yeah, I was on the top form there, that was really good fun, everybody was engaged, everyone was having a really good time. We know when we deliver sessions like that, young people tend to come back. So that's all obviously reflected in the research and also probably pretty strongly reflected in our own practice. So when Jean explains this idea of interest, he displays it as 2 different concepts. So the first one on the left-hand side of what you can see here is a situational interest. And this is related to the emotion triggered by a kind of environmental stimuli. So when we think about developing an interest in something, it has to be triggered by some form of stimuli. So in this instance, it's namely the proximity and therefore exposure to particular sports, which triggers the initial situational interest. And when this is then coupled with an affective reaction, which we've got on the sort of right-hand side, we then develop an individual interest. So that's when we kind of have a strong interest to the point where we develop a desire to re-engage with that activity because we perhaps have now begun to associate positive feelings towards it. So to relate this to my own experience, as a young girl, I lived in close proximity to a hockey pitch, and this was enough for me to develop a situational interest where I attended junior hockey for a number of years. And this then manifested into an individual interest as I began to make connections with the sport over time, connections to friends, coaches, to the club, and this developed a sort of individual desire to go back again and again and again. So you can see how this concept of interest in short is almost like an environment setting up an activity which causes a positive emotion, which over time develops into an individual interest. Now, I'm not sure if anyone's having the same thoughts as me on this, but I just wanted to share what some of my thoughts were when Jean went through this. In listening to him highlighting the sort of interesting concept behind the immediate experience, as a practitioner within snow sports, this carried quite a heavy thought, particularly the difficulties that we might face around situational interest. Are we perhaps competing with other sports under this thinking, would they therefore monopolise this field for young people? And perhaps an area for further personal research and reflection for me might be to look at how the individual interest would be sort of somewhat affected by the lack of situational interest due to geographical constraints. So should this have an impact on my interactions and coaching with young people, was something that stood out to me here that I thought would warrant some further consideration. So those were only my personal thoughts, but I am going to take a short pause here basically we've gone over a sort of whistle-stop tour of the personal assets framework. Next, what we'll go on to look at is the three elements: the activity, the setting, and the social dynamics, which are the things that within Jean's research suggests that coaches are able to influence and change. But for just now, as Ian said at the beginning, I'm just going to leave some time here for you to perhaps ask some questions in the chat box, or I don't know if you'd like to unmute and come forward and ask a question, please feel free. No? Okay, we'll move on then. Well, actually, there were a few questions which I asked and have been since discussed with some of our colleagues, which might be interesting to briefly share just quickly before we move on. But it brought up questions to me around the desired outcomes of our programs. So specifically, my colleagues and I have been having a discussion around how we perhaps assess success within our disciplines. So how do we measure if a young person has been successful in their learning? Is it mainly based for us in snow sports on results, points, even medals, or skills-based assessment score sheets? How are we assessing that success? So how would we then look to perhaps accommodate for assessing success within alternative pathways, more participation-based pathways or personal development pathways? And are we making it clear to individuals that they have been successful within those pathways? Are we providing a framework for assessment for them to encourage them and to allow them to create goals and targets and to continue to develop within the sport in whichever capacity they choose? I'll share that with you. And also as well, just in relation to pathways as well, it did pose a question for me to consider to what extent we're supporting young people in multiple pathways. So if Jean's research suggests that we don't necessarily need to select one pathway at the expense of another, are we supporting this notion of multiple pathways, and how do we evidence that in the programs that we're providing? Ian, I can just see some notifications at the top. I just wondered if you wanted to have a look at those to check.
Yes, indeed, we do have some questions ready for them. First one from Ross Gardner. Great presentation, Christy. Are there some practical examples you could give for skiing?
Yes, so we are going to go on in the next sort of stage of the presentation to look at these dynamic elements, so the activities and the settings and the social dynamics. So when we go into that, we could perhaps provide some more skiing-specific examples of things that, as coaches, we could influence. I hope that answers that. Okay.
From Joseph Eden, in terms of sport, hockey is competitive from day one. Do you see the same in snow sports?
Would I say the same in snow sports? So with hockey, I suppose it was competitive from day one, but what I was referring to was a sort of junior hockey setup where actually we did a lot of non-competitive stuff. But I do agree with what you're saying, and do I think that skiing is competitive from day one? It depends, depending on what pathway our individuals are on. So if we've got perhaps people that are coming in at school level and attending we're supporting them in ski trips, and we're supporting them to have introductions and tasters towards competition, but we're perhaps not necessarily emphasising that. And we might be looking more at personal development within that. It's maybe not necessarily competitive. If we look at it in the sort of aspect that I'm involved in at the moment, which is obviously alpine racing, we do very quickly put our young people onto competitive pathways, onto performance pathways. And later on in the presentation, again, we're going to discuss this notion of early specialisation and have a look at what I believe to be one of the reasons why we might have young people competing at a performance level quite early on in alpine skiing.
Okay, from Graham Jack, was there any discussion on how to monitor personal assets?
No, There wasn't actually. So we're going to look at how to monitor our own kind of interpersonal skills later on within a sort of recording system for that. There wasn't any discussion in the research actually as to how we can assess young people's personal development. So that's one of the questions that I was sort of posing within that on my reflections was how are we sharing that our young people have been successful in those kind of outcomes. We're very good at showing them that they've gotten faster. We're very good at showing them that they've lowered their points. We're very good at putting a medal around their neck if they've arrived on the podium. But how do we share the success and quantify the success of these other outcomes? So it is what I sort of identified, Graham, as being something that I'd like to look into.
Okay, and if you're going to come back to that, Ross has added that that's particularly with relation to getting more females through the way.
Okay.
Interested in that.
Yeah.
Louise Hasty from G-Snow has very kindly shared a document there for anyone who wants to have a look at it of their interpretation as a club and their coaching program on Jean Cote's work, which I won't know just now, but for anyone who wants that, we'll obviously make sure that's saved. And the recording, of course, we'll keep the links available to those who watch this afterwards. But that's all the questions at the moment, in Christy.
Okay. All right. So have I moved that on? Yes. So as we've sort of explained within the model, these are the dynamic elements, and these are the things that Jean tells us that through his research as coaches we can influence to change a desired effect in relation to the short and long-term outcomes. So in relation to those 4 C's and 3 P's, he suggests that if we directly make decisions to change the setting, the activity or the social dynamic, we will then have an impact on those. These dynamic elements shouldn't be new. There seems to be agreement within the literature that development doesn't occur because of one variable, it occurs because of a result of a multitude of variables. But the significance of Jean and his colleagues working in this is that they put this into gears that interact together. So the first one is the appropriate setting, which is obviously defined by physical setting and the place where the sport actually takes place. The activity refers to the organised sporting activity that individuals are obviously engaging in, and social dynamics, well, this is obviously sport is carried out with people, so the interactions that occur during sport and the connections that you make with people when you take part in sport. So this is where things begin to look slightly more complex, and as you can see, we've got the same 3 gears displayed on the screen. However, we've now begun to add some layers. So what Jean and his colleagues have done is that they have edited them to introduce proximal and distal aspects of each of the elements. So for example, if we take the setting in the top left, the most proximal aspect of the setting is the playing field, and then as we move through the layers we go to club organisation and structure, and then at the most distal section we've got community and league structure. If we look at personal engagement and activities, at the most proximal we've got the sport of interest, we've then got the complementary physical activities, and then at the most distal we've got the complementary activities. With quality social dynamics, we've got relationships through to team dynamics and social environment. So this model kind of illustrates the different layers of influence for each of these dynamic elements. And you guys might be looking at this and might recognise that as coaches, it seems to us more obvious that these layers that are more proximal seem to be the more likely points of influence. And as we move out towards more distal elements, so say for example in settings, as we move out to things like community and league structure, these things become more ecological and more dynamic and a little bit out with our ability to change or to alter. So if we now look at these layers and kind of further investigate them a little bit more, we can start to see, and this is I think relating to perhaps Ross's question with regards to what can we actually do and change. And I know that a lot of these examples, because this is Canadian research, it's obviously tailored mainly towards team sport, but we can come up with some suggestions as we go in relation to snow sports. Obviously, my expertise is mainly in alpine racing, but I can have a go. So basically, we start to see how if we change these things, we could influence the 3 Ps and the 4 Cs seen within the personal assets framework. So the layers can be broken down, and we can sort of see where our reach as coaches really lies. So if we look at appropriate settings, for example, on the left-hand side, we can see that approximately we could make decisions around the playing field. So, for example, within the research, Jean has said something like the size of the playing field, the number of the athletes, or the size of the equipment. So perhaps if I was to relate this to snow sports, and probably particularly alpine racing, we might decide to choose a particular slope gradient to suit the aims of our session. We might decide to make decisions based on the size of the equipment. So we may alter between full gates, stubbies and brushes, depending on the desired outcome of the session. So you can see how you might adapt these kind of settings to start to make changes and to start to influence your outcomes. It becomes more obvious that according to the framework here, when you look at it broken down, that pedagogically making these decisions and coupling that about the setting and then coupling that with the sort of engagement and activities and the social dynamics, we do have quite a big influence on what we can achieve and how we can kind of change those outcomes and change how the session might look, and in turn how multiple seasons might look at the end goal. In relation to females within this, which was obviously part of Ross's question, I would perhaps look more towards the quality social dynamics for that one, and particularly the relationships. I think when coaching females, the sort of coach-athlete relationship is really important, and we will start to talk about some of those interpersonal skills that are really important there. But when working with females, we generally tend to perhaps adopt some interpersonal skills which mean that we are more empathetic perhaps, and we can be slightly lighter on our tone and our delivery, to perhaps support females a little bit more in a competitive sporting environment. So I'm just going to move this on. We're going to look at some of the research that actually underpins some of these changes to give you some more ideas of things that you can look at. But in relation to the dimension of appropriate settings, there's an abundance of research which Jean has shared to inform decisions that you might make here. So at the level 1, which is the most proximal to the playing field, we can create modified environments that are developmentally appropriate enforced through competitive engineering. In team sports, you can ensure that all teams are equal or that everyone has a chance to win and lose. Again, to maybe try and align this to alpine racing, we might provide a timing session in which athletes could maybe be given time penalties. Or perhaps, I'm not an expert, but maybe in Nordic, you could stagger your start to allow for a slightly more competitive training session, whereby those athletes who maybe usually run from the back experience running from the front and vice versa. So we could also manage the size of the field or the constraints of the competition. Is it always necessary to judge your disciplines in the conventional way that they're judged? So could they possibly be flipped on their head? In relation to alpine, could we perhaps, rather than assessing based on time, could we occasionally during training flip it on its head and judge it against a score sheet based on fundamental technical elements and technical techniques? Just shooting from the hip there, but anyway, I'm sure that you guys will be able to think of lots of ideas. But at level 2, within the club organisation structures, we can look at how athletes are grouped and banded and how they might train together. So one particular key area of focus for us within our Snowsport Scotland Alpine programme at the moment is how we support transition periods within key age groups and endeavouring to provide opportunities that would shake up normal training environments and mix athletes together in a less conventional way and to support them through those transition periods. At level 3 in community structure, this is obviously a lot more distal and it refers to birthplace. So does talent develop better geographically depending on the communities that support them? So there's a wealth of research as well that looks into the differences between big towns and so like big cities and small towns and how that might impact on kind of talent development, and also proximity to practice, which relates back to some of that situational interest that we spoke about a bit earlier on. So if we have a look at the engagement in activities and where our point of influence as coaches might be at the level 1, Jean presents research to support structuring deliberate practice to support that particular sport of interest. And there's lots of research available there to suggest different ways that you could structure different types of activities. At the second level, there's a really interesting debate, and I touched on this earlier on, there's a really interesting debate around early specialisation versus early sampling, and at what age it's appropriate to specialise. So as you can see there in that box, there is plenty of research available to look into this. But research shows that sampling is a healthy way towards elite performance, so perhaps doing more than one sport up until the age of 13, 14, 15, depending on the sport. Just another personal opinion of mine thrown in here amongst Jean's great research is that I look at thinking about this from the snow sports perspective. This it presents some challenge there. It strikes me as an environment where, you know, in competing in snow sports, a great deal of time sacrifice is made to travelling across the country, giving up weekends, perhaps travelling across to Europe and travelling large distances. So within this situation, how do we support the notion of sampling? Because do we as coaches need to be wary that by the very nature of our sport within Scotland, early specialisation can be a sort of unfortunate or unnecessary and sometimes unwanted byproduct as a result of that kind of geographical challenges that's presented purely by the sort of time that young people spend travelling around the place to be part of a performance pathway, I suppose. And at the level 3, an abundance of research also highlights that engaging in diverse activities outside and alongside sport is really good for personal development. So I'd like to just pose a quick question here, and feel free to unmute yourself and shout out if you know, but has anybody picked up on any kind of common theme here across the 3 levels of the engagement in activities? Has anybody picked up on any key themes? Somebody typed. You're muted, Ian.
Louise has responded with non-linear.
Good, not quite the one I was going for, but yeah, like a really important concept for sure. So we're talking about the kind of activities that individuals could take part in and the importance of taking part in multiple activities. More?
Breadth and non-specialisation, or no specialisation?
Good, so breadth is good, yeah. So almost, the word that I was thinking of, and I'm not sure if someone's just typed it because I can't actually see what's in the type box, but the word that I was thinking of was diversity.
Variety, so, yeah, variety's just popped up.
Yeah.
Erin, who wins the prize.
Good, so essentially within sort of Jean's, I guess, display of this research to do with engagement in activities, a really important concept and a thread that seems to tie these together is this notion of diversity. So at the level of the sport, diversity, within a session, diversity, and between sport and between activities, also to focus on diversity. So it seems like when we're talking about this, the take-home nugget for us is that diversity in activities in and around and between sports leads to more positive long-term outcomes for individuals in sport. So if we just have a quick look at the social dynamics, I think this is the last one, so we're just going to have a look at some of the research that's presented here. Jean's displayed, again, loads of research when talking about relationships and quality of social dynamics in sport. So when we talk about the level 1, at the level of the relationships, there's lots of information relating to coach-athlete relationships, knowing your athletes, adopting a person-centered approach, producing autonomy, supportive coaching, and really having that positive relationship. I think that we know that the development of young people, having that relationship with them is really important, and that comes obviously proximally with the relationship with the coach. Again, at level 2, it's a similar story in relation to team dynamics. There's plenty of research to talk about motivational climate when working with teams and with peers. With the level 3, it's noted that there's less research available in relation to the social environment in terms of peer interaction. But the key kind of take-home message, or the point that was evident in the learning, was that basically social dynamics should essentially help athletes to feel that they're important and to feel that what they do is important, to make them feel valued, and above all, to really make them feel included within the coaching process, and to make them feel part of that process. So at this point, I'm just going to take another break, some time for some questions or some thoughts on these dynamic elements, or maybe some suggestions as to things that maybe people have tried and influencing these that relate directly to snow sports. Next, we'll be going on to look at the concepts of transformational leadership and transformational coaching. So I've just popped up the dynamic element layers for you there to have a quick look at. So yeah, I think before we kind of move on to talk about those aspects of transformational leadership and coaching, it's important to really understand sort of where in the system we as coaches can have influence over those long-term outcomes before season the 3 Ps. So perhaps if you've got anything that you'd like to pop in the chat box or unmute yourself, please go ahead.
So while we're waiting for a couple of questions there, Christy, just a couple of comments. One from Derek Tate, who's mentioned the book Range by David Epstein, supported much by Hasty, who says great book. But Alan Shepherd, his question is the context of early specialization here with regards to one sport or another, or more specific, such as a specific discipline within one sport?
That's an interesting concept, and one that I actually hadn't really thought about there. When discussing it through kind of John's teaching, he was talking about how it is sport dependent. So obviously some sports will encourage earlier specialisation as opposed to other sports. But it would be interesting for us to consider perhaps within snow sports if there's a difference for us between the different disciplines.
Graham Jack has commented with, notice there is no coach-parent relationship on the social dynamic box. Relationship considered possibly more as a potential barrier to the development of the pathway.
Sorry, are you saying that you've noticed that there's no there's no coach-parent? Interesting. Can you just repeat that question again?
Yeah, Graham, would you like to just make comment there for Christy's benefit, if you can unmute for a second?
Yeah, can you hear me okay, Christy?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it was just, we've also got coach, athlete, parent and stuff. It was just whether actually that dynamic with a coach and a parent, more so in the, could a parent, if we've got as coaches this development pathway, looking at all the 4 Cs and the 3 Ps, could that relationship be important, maybe as a potential barrier to that?
Yeah, no, definitely. It's a really good question, and again, something that actually that hadn't stood out to me when I looked at this initially. And we know, like as coaches, we have had those interactions with parents that perhaps maybe haven't gone the way that we hoped they had, and perhaps we've then noticed that might have had an impact on perhaps how we're desperately trying not to allow that to affect our interaction with the young person, or perhaps the young person is aware and they then change in their interactions with us. So it does definitely, you can see how that is an important relationship, and one I guess Jean hasn't included within his research. Maybe we should contact him.
Okay, now a question from Ross. How important is having female coaches in the dynamics to encourage more females?
I think it is important. I think, don't quote me on the research, but from my teaching degree, I know that I have seen research before that has implied that relationships, that you can say that there's a body of research that suggests that relationships for female participants, they find it easier to relate to female coaches. It's all about that relatability. But I don't really believe that that it doesn't mean to say that male coaches can't also understand how to use their interpersonal knowledge to support females in their development. I think it is important to have female figures because there's that relatability. But I don't think that it necessarily means that girls shouldn't be therefore coached by males. I do believe that obviously there's a certain skill set required, which female coaches have to also understand and learn to use as well. That can better support girls in sports. So I think it's really important to have female figures. I don't think it is necessarily completely 100% essential. I'm not saying that an athlete wouldn't develop towards those long-term outcomes if they didn't have a female coach, if that makes sense.
And Callum's just raised another question to almost follow up on Graham. Coach and its impact on the athletes can alter a dynamic in a team, club, sport. Thoughts on the coach and its impact on athletes?
Yeah, so kind of like inter-staff relationships between coaches. Is that what that means? Sorry, I'm not actually reading it. So,
Callum, could you comment, please?
Yeah, it's just the dynamic between, if you've got, say, like a phys team or something, if you've got two coaches and there's an unsuitable dynamic, or there's not even unsuitable, just depending on how the chemistry of the two work together and how that can impact on the athlete as well as the parent's perspective. Just thoughts on that in the wider field, basically.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting consideration, actually. Like, it's all to do with that kind of ethos and that environment, isn't it? And if we've got an environment of coaching staff who evidently work really well together, and they are working to support one another, that inevitably filters down to the athletes, and that's what they see, and that's what we will go on to talk about, practice what you preach. And it is that showing empathy for each other and that kind of culture that you create, which inevitably kind of alters the dynamic of the group. So again, a really important insight. I think that is definitely really relevant, especially in some sports as well, when we spend a lot of time traveling around and perhaps on camps, and we don't necessarily only have contact with athletes at particular training centres. We actually have contact with them almost 24 hours a day. And they really get an understanding of what the dynamic is. You can't really hide it, and they really feel the kind of, I suppose, the feeling behind the kind of coaching staff. So it definitely would impact on the kind of productivity and I suppose that those 3 Ps at the end.
That's all the questions there, Christy.
Great. Okay. So we'll just move it on, just to get us started on the kind of next section. We're kind of moving on to the next kind of section of the presentation. So I just want to propose a quick activity, and I hope that you're all still with me. But I'm inviting you basically to use the chat box. It'd be great if you could pop as many ideas down. You don't have to just put down one, but what I want you to do is to try and think about the best coach, leader, or instructor that you've ever had, a mentor who's perhaps had a really positive influence on your life. And what do you think the key behaviours were which characterised how they led? So just quick fire, just chuck some words in the chat box, and that will be really useful for us for the next kind of section. Just going to just 10 seconds just to pop something in there. Are we getting some stuff in?
Nothing yet, no.
Oh, come on, guys.
Here we go.
We've all had great coaches.
Yeah, sense of humour,
Hopefully.
decisive on their plan, motivational, positive and effective communication, enthusiasm, able to lighten the move, I should say, involving athletes in the process, good at communicating, adaptable, encouraging, clear objectives are shared, and what everyone says, banter, great stuff out of the day, even whether big challenges on weather, simple explanations, enthusiastic, interested, succinct, able to explain things in different ways, knowledgeable, able to inspire.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks for reading those out.
And fair.
Great. Okay, thanks for reading those out. So I was hoping from the words to identify a little bit of a pattern. I'm not sure if anybody could identify a pattern there and wants to unmute themselves and perhaps shout out some suggestions. Sorry, I'm conscious that some people don't really like it when it's interactive and you've got to shout things out, but I don't know if anybody noticed any patterns there.
I should just add that Joseph Eden really wanted us to get fun in there as well, and has thrown that
Good.
in.
Definitely important.
So the comments are, all things were positive and they were all personality traits.
Good. Okay, so close. So essentially what we want to try and do is we want to try and provide a bit of a framework to categorize these words. So how could we provide a little bit of a framework? And essentially there's a number of words there that stand out to me, and those words can be categorized basically into two different categories, or I'm sort of trying to suggest that they could be categorized into two different categories. And those categories are professional knowledge and behaviours and inter and intrapersonal knowledge and behaviours. So a lot of the words that people go to when they try and think about a great coach or a great leader that they've potentially had in the past is things like empathetic, understanding, kind, caring, motivating, inspiring, all of these interpersonal kind of qualities and that they might possess. These tend to be the things that people remember about coaches. Whilst we can't discount professional skills, so for example, if I want to be an elite level park and pipe coach, well, that would be a bit of a laugh, seeing as I can't even do a 360. But if I wanted to do that, I would have to understand the professional knowledge behind the skill acquisition and know how to deliver specific feedback on those technical elements. However, the overwhelming kind of words that people remember when they think about those outstanding coaches is their interpersonal skills. And so what the remainder of this presentation hopes to do is to basically show these interpersonal skills as a key part of the framework towards transformational coaching. So if we just have a look at coaching effectiveness, this can be sort of looked at as the what and the how. So we've got the professional knowledge and behaviours, which I kind of discussed briefly there, and those are kind of critical, I suppose, in providing a foundation in fostering athlete skill development. So the organisation of the coach, the instruction, the feedback, the actual skill knowledge, these are essential. But the interpersonal and the intrapersonal knowledge and behaviours provides the effectiveness of that delivery. So are you caring? Are you personable? Are you kind? Are you approachable? The kind of leading which meets the demands for personal development alongside that technical development. So as you can see from the bottom of the slide there is a raft of research that indicates that if you want to become an expert coach, you need these interpersonal skills alongside the professional knowledge. So basically, just to kind of summarise that, the interpersonal and the intrapersonal skills possessed by the coach provides a kind of added ingredient to supporting athlete development. So for example, things like motivational and emotional tone, content and structure of behaviours, and the kind of timing of those behaviours as well are all really important considerations that must come alongside the delivery of those technical elements. So the research kind of tells us that without this interpersonal and intrapersonal knowledge of ourselves, it isn't really possible to foster long-term holistic athlete development. So it's at this point that we kind of introduce this notion of transformational leadership, and how do we get athletes to feel good about themselves in the sport environment and feel autonomy in what they're doing, which, if you remember, is one of the things that we discussed back when we were looking at the social dynamics. So how as coaches can we achieve this? We can look to this idea of transformational leadership to give us some kind of a concept towards it. So the model that was displayed to us by Jean is a really nice way to visualise interpersonal skill in sport at the level of the leader, which is the level of the coach or the instructor. So if we look at this model, you can see that essentially you can be effective in leadership or ineffective in leadership, and you can be engaged in leadership or not engaged in leadership. And we can see from the model that you can be engaged and ineffective. So this would present toxic leadership, and the kind of qualities that are associated with this would be things like anger and hostility. Or if you do nothing at all and you're not engaged, it would represent laissez-faire leadership, so basically showing no interest. So we see a lot of things to do with, we see a lot of behaviours in coaches, things like looking at their phones, or perhaps having too much banter with the people that they work with, and maybe not necessarily being really engaged in that. So that would represent laissez-faire leadership. The neutral, according to Jean, is where most coaches are placed within their research studies. These are coaches who seem to sort of go through the kind of motions and complete monotonous practice, which lacks expression and enthusiasm. And the transactional is the idea of using reward and punishment to alter behaviours. Another quick question, sorry, I know I'm asking a lot of questions, but feel free to unmute and shout out or put it in the chat box. But why might reward and punishment not work in relation to long-term athlete development?
It's from Ross.
What did it say, sorry?
It's external.
Yeah, so exactly. So it causes an issue with a lack of intrinsic motivation. So if we continually reward and punish, we could necessarily see some improvements and some gains, but eventually the kind of kick of that reward, or the hit of that reward, I suppose, for want of a better phrase, really wears off, and it doesn't, we don't develop that intrinsic motivation that we really need to stick with the sport and to carry on through the kind of tougher times. So here that you can also see that that idea of transformational leadership positions you within an engaged and effective space where you would represent a highly effective style of coaching. And that's the kind of where we're sort of heading for, or what we should be aiming to be engaged and effective. But Jean's research does also recognise that coaches can't be transformational 100% of the time, and they can move from one style to another. But the research does indicate that the less time spent in toxic and less say fair zones seems to lead to better outcomes. But we can intersperse between different zones from time to time, and you may choose as well. To adopt a different approach or a different space based on a desired outcome within your coaching practice or within your pedagogy. So we can intersperse between these from time to time. So I've now mentioned transformational leadership a few times. So what is transformational leadership? Well, Jean basically describes this as the process where coaches, leaders and instructors develop athletes into leaders themselves by focusing on athletes' personal assets involving behaviours that are designed to empower and also to challenge athletes. And this relates to the 4 C's, which you saw in the personal assets framework a little bit earlier on. Those 4 C's being those personal kind of qualities that we would look to develop. So basically, what we're doing here is we're attempting to kind of foster the outcomes relating to the 3 P's by adopting this transformational leadership approach. And it's conceptualized and presented by Turnage and Cote as the 4 I's of transformational leadership. So the model that's presented on the screen shows them for you. It's idealized influence, inspirational motivation, intellectual stimulation, and individualized consideration. Essentially, idealized influence is practice what you preach, which I kind of mentioned earlier on. And some of us might be guilty of this here when we maybe perhaps at the side of the hill tuck into a Mars bar, or send the athletes for a jog around the car park and don't go with them. So there's a few things that are coming to mind. But yeah, basically, essentially, it's referring to that kind of practice what you preach notion, and what you expect of your athletes, they should see reflected in your qualities as well. Inspirational motivation, this is obviously looking at believing in your athletes. So do you really live your athletes' goals with them, irrespective of what they might be? Are you really involved in that process? And do you believe that they're achievable? And do you join them on that journey and really live every success and every failure as they go? Intellectual stimulation, this is involving athletes in the coaching process. So my own personal reflections of this within my practice would be, am I providing opportunity for personalisation and choice within my sessions? And do I allow for space and time within the session for self-assessment and for athletes to make suggestions and to try out things in terms of where they want to go next with their personal development? And we've got individualised consideration. So this relates to adopting a person-centred approach. So when we have a group of kids, basically, I would look at this as, when I've got a group of kids, am I allowing for differentiation within that group to meet the needs of all the kids that are there? So do I give more challenging activities and less challenging activities depending on the individuals that I've got? Or do I just try and go for the easy option, which is a one-size-fits-all, here's my session, take it or leave it? Similarly, do we also provide stretch and challenge within that as well for those that require that too? So, basically from this model of transformational leadership, we can begin to now have a look at and understand some of the behaviours that are associated with transformational coaching. So Jean Cote's research over a number of years has focused on observing many coaches within competitions and practices, and they've kind of attempted to understand what these 4 I's look like, perhaps in relation to coaching behaviours. And the culmination of this research has presented a list of behaviours that are associated with the outcomes of the 4 C's and the 3 P's from the personal assets framework. Their research basically, essentially, as you would expect, indicates that if coaches express more of these behaviours, then there is inevitably an increase in short and long-term athlete personal development. If they display less of these behaviours and more toxic behaviours, then we tend to see a decline in progress. These behaviours directly fit with the 4 I's, so that's why it's referred to as transformational coaching within their model. And if we have a look at it in a little bit more detail, we can see number 1 and number 2, discussing and modelling pro-social values or behaviours and showing vulnerability and humility. These sit within idealised influences. And Cote's research asserts that when we see coaches, for example, discussing the rules with kids, or the importance of having respect for their teammates and for others, the umpires, when coaches apologise when they make a mistake or perhaps they're late, this falls under the idea of idealised influence. Coaches who are able to display these kind of behaviours and become human have athletes who tend to score higher in relation to their outcomes. As we kind of move down the list, we can see how the behaviours the behaviours that have been encapsulated on the left-hand side fall into the categories from the remainder of the 4 I's. So things like discussing goals and expectations, expressing confidence. So in summary to this, basically, Jean's research insists that coaches should be integrating these 11 behaviours into their coaching more to support athletes' development. And if we kind of endeavour to present these behaviours more frequently and more regularly, we will spend more time in that transformational coaching, transformational leadership zone, and will ultimately positively impact the 4 C's and the 3 P's at the end. So before I move on to go into some of these behaviours in a little bit more detail, there's just a quick pause to take any questions on transformational leadership and transformational coaching as a kind of concept. And then we'll move on to the final section, which will have a look at some of these behaviours in even more detail. So if you want to pop questions in the box, or if you want to unmute yourself, then go ahead.
Nothing.
No?
No.
Okay, no worries. So we can just fire straight on. So we're just going to have a look at these, and perhaps we can make some connections for ourselves. So if we kind of go through these 11 behaviours, we might be able to make connections or to identify where in our own practice we might already be doing these certain behaviours, and perhaps there might be some behaviours that you think, oh, that I could implement that really easily by doing X, I suppose. So from above we can see idealised influence, which is one of the 4 I's from transformational leadership in relation to coaching behaviours, and this can be seen through discussing, as we said, and modelling pro-social values and behaviours. So this is perhaps doing what is right rather than what is convenient to you, demonstrating your personal beliefs and making yourself appear approachable and sort of human, I suppose, showing vulnerability and humility by apologising for your mistakes and sharing your experiences. So Cote kind of summarises this really nicely as idealised influence as practice what you preach. And I think in coaching, if we were to practice what we preach, it really does develop a kind of an environment of trust, where we can understand why, for obvious reasons, that would be important to young people, to feel like there's trust, and that what you expect of them is expected of yourself, and that real understanding of perhaps your more personal self is really important. Inspirational motivation, within the 4 I's of transformational leadership, this can be reflected in the coaching behaviours to discussing goals and expectations. So creating a shared understanding of where you're going and how you see yourself, see the athlete getting there. Expressing confidence in athletes' capabilities and enhancing athletes' beliefs in their own capabilities. implementing a collective vision and connecting individuals to the team, using symbols and stories to do this, and providing meaningful and challenging tasks and roles, offering explanations and rationales. So again, this is sort of quite nicely summarised by Cote into simply believing in your athletes. So within your practice, do you believe in your athletes? Intellectual stimulation. So this I can be reflected in the coaching behaviours such as eliciting athlete input, so encouraging athletes to contribute new and alternative ideas to the training sessions, sharing decision-making and leadership responsibilities, so giving athletes the opportunity to lead, perhaps to lead a warm-up, to lead a cool-down, to lead a peer teaching session, emphasising the learning process, so encouraging athletes to engage in challenging tasks, and valuing the effort and the learning rather than just the outcomes. So valuing the small gains and not necessarily the bigger gains. I think that that this one, intellectual stimulation, is really fruitful. Generally, young children respond really well to responsibility. So it's important to think, like, within our practice, when do we provide opportunities when it's appropriate, and that kind of, when do we provide opportunities for our young people to take responsibility of some of the tasks that are involved in that? And I find from my own experience that when we have the opportunity to do that and when it's appropriate, we tend to find that the morale and the application of the individuals automatically lifts because they really thrive on that responsibility. So using approaches like these can really help in training sessions when they've gone a bit flat, or when they need a little bit of a shake-up. Yes, of course, it is easier to give direct instructions. So in order to get a desired outcome, like to achieve Y, do X, or whatever, that is the easiest and the most simple way to achieve the desired outcome. But to adopt this approach of involving the athletes in the process, although the cost here is time and you don't know what the outcome is that you might get, it is really beneficial for the athletes to, one, feel involved in that process, and to two, learn from that process. But there is skill involved here in adopting this approach, and it obviously with young people it is necessary to apply some skill to guiding that process and to steering the learner through that process. But I think particularly in young people, this idea of sort of encouraging athletes to be involved in the process and use that intellectual stimulation is really beneficial. So essentially, intellectual stimulation is involving your athletes in the coaching process. So that's how it's been summarised by Cote. So finally, the last I within transformational leadership can be reflected with individualised consideration, and the coaching behaviours that are associated with that are showing interest in athletes' feelings and perspectives, so adapting activities to suit individual needs, displaying genuine care and concern for athletes' lives both in and out of sport, and recognising athlete accomplishments and contributions, providing feedback on athletes' behaviours, and the power of a thank you as well. I think an important aspect to the individualised consideration is the connections that we should make really outside of the sport of interest. So recognising what's going on in their wider lives is a really good way to kind of target this. Is there something that's happened that we should mention that we could congratulate individuals for, or could there be something that's happened that we should really know about to inform and to guide our planning and our practice when we then next interact with that individual, in terms of providing them with additional support and ensuring that they get a good experience from the training session. The power of thank you as well. I think quite often whenever you use that in a session, you find that children don't really expect you to say it. When you say thank you very much for working very hard, they kind of get a bit taken aback, and I'm sure plenty of people say it to them, but they're always taught to say thank you to others and to not necessarily be thanked themselves as young people. So it's quite an interesting one to use. So this is described. Sorry,
Christy, I was going to just a small observation there from Duncan Shepherd, who says that's interesting. Typically, he would only offer older athletes the opportunity to lead.
Yeah, so when appropriate, obviously is the kind of the key statement there, when appropriate. And I think for younger athletes, it obviously has to be done in quite a controlled environment, and that's where I was kind of talking about that skill that's involved in it. It's maybe not necessary to basically oversimplify it to say, here's the equipment, go. It's maybe not possible to necessarily do that. You can kind of use your skill to guide and to lead that process, but allowing the individual to feel like they're at the helm, so that there is an element of skill involved in that.
Yeah, and Louise has just added that with just a couple of simple comments and comments she would use with kids, like, show us how you would do that, or depending upon the level, can you lead the new member of the group down?
Can you what? Sorry, I missed the last bit.
Louise, do you want to pipe up and just...
Yeah, it was in response to Duncan's kind of question about the age of athletes and giving them the leading opportunity. Just thinking about, as Christy said, it's that kind of skill of figuring out those little things that can give kids the feeling of leadership. So it could be as simple as, you've got a new person in the group, Johnny, can you actually lead this new kid down the hill? And it gives them a little bit of sense of responsibility. Or can you show them how we do X or Y? Just those little things. Yeah,
no, definitely. They're really good suggestions, and they would be really effective with youngsters, I think. I mean, you can imagine, can't you, like on your first day, just turning up, and all of a sudden, like, so it's as well the benefit of that to the other young person, who immediately makes a connection with a friend as well. So it's a really powerful tool. So yeah, just to move on, this individualized consideration is obviously, as it says here, kind of encapsulated by a person-centered approach, which I guess is a kind of theory that's perhaps not new to us. We do understand as coaches that we should be looking to tailor our sessions to the needs of the individuals, and not as a kind of one-size-fits-all approach. So we have to be aware and understand and really know each of the individuals that we're working with in order to be able to achieve that. So it's kind of like a cause and effect, maybe. But yeah, we have to really get to know the details about those people that we're working with in order to be able to achieve this person-centered approach. So the significance of this research, I suppose, is that what it presents to us now, that Cote and his colleagues are essentially working towards having something usable that allows us to measure these interpersonal skills and these coaching behaviours. So an observation system that would allow us to deduce the kind of percentage that a coach might spend within their practice being transformational, transactional, neutral, laissez-faire, or toxic. So through the development of these kind of behavioural categories, we can now begin to code our behaviours that are observed in the field and indicate how effective our coaching has been or is being. This is something that they're currently working on at the moment. So before I summarise, I think my presentation has maybe gone slightly over, but we've had some really good questions, really good insights, so it's been good. But I just want you to just spend just a sort of 20 second reflection on this final task. Having had a look at some of these coaching behaviours, perhaps there are many that you are already doing, which is fantastic. Perhaps there are some that you would like to start doing, and perhaps there are maybe some that you think on reflection maybe that's not beneficial, or maybe that's not adding anything to your coaching styles. So just have a quick think before we move on around those 11 behaviours of effective coaching, and you can either, well, I suppose we've kind of run over a little bit. I think we've not run over, but we've sort of gone a little bit longer than we kind of expected. So to save time for questions at the end, maybe just take this task away with you as a kind of reflection later, to think about the kinds of behaviours that you would perhaps like to start doing, to keep doing, and to stop doing, that you could introduce going forwards. So I think I'll probably move on, if that's all right, Ian. Okay. So just to summarise, obviously this, I hope I've done this research justice in a sense, and I've managed to kind of convey the kind of nuts and bolts of it. There is a lot out there and a lot of reading that you could look into if you're interested in it, but I've just displayed the personal assets framework from earlier in the presentation, and the message presented by Jean in his teaching through this personal assets framework is that we should use it in order to understand that we should think about sporting outcomes as being staggered and sequential. So we should not only think about the long-term outcomes, but also think about the fact that there is no long-term if the short-term is not interesting, enjoyable, and fun for the individuals involved. And his kind of parting message with this, to do with this element of the teaching, was that it highlights the nature of effective coaching. So we must use that effective coaching, that transformational coaching, to focus on the development of the 3 C's and what we decide to do in our immediate sessions and to deliver through the immediate sport experience. And the long-term outcomes over multiple seasons will inevitably take care of themselves or happen themselves. And then just to have a look at the kind of transformational coaching behaviours that we've looked at as well, it's possible for us now to have a look at some of these behaviours and to reflect on our own practice in relation to the 11 behaviours and understand now how these might fit into coaching as a wider aspect of a system, and understand how by working on perhaps some elements of these 4 I's and working on some specific behaviours within the transformational coaching framework, we can now start to kind of investigate the relationship and the balance between our professional knowledge and also our understanding of our inter and intrapersonal knowledge that we have, and how we kind of balance this within our pedagogy and how we approach our planning and our delivery to make sure that we are taking consideration for this. And the framework can also sort of give us, I guess, just an understanding of where we can start with that and what we could do within these 4 I's to work towards that goal. So that's me. Thank you very much. I think this is us. Thanks so much for your time, and thanks very much for listening. I hope that you found it useful or interesting, and that the personal assets framework and the transformational coaching behaviours can be something that you could perhaps take forward and have a look at as you go into the new season. There will be a link on the website, which I've just linked in there, to some of the resources and to this recording as well. But I'd welcome any final questions just now before we finish off. We do have a little bit of time left. I'm sure that some people are probably desperate to maybe get off for the tea, but we do have some time left if anybody would like to ask any final questions.